Country music has always run on heartache, highways, and hard liquor. It's practically written into the DNA of the genre. But there's a difference between singing about whiskey and showing up to a sold-out arena so far gone you can't remember the words to your own songs. These 12 artists didn't just push the line between legend and liability, they crossed it completely, stumbled back over it, and somehow became more iconic because of it. Buckle up, this one gets messy. Number 12, Willie Nelson.
Maybe I didn't love you.
Before we get into the darker stories on this list, the one that almost feels like a celebration. Because when people talk about Willie Nelson and substances, there's a certain warmth to it, a kind of shared understanding. Willie was Willie, and Willie was going to do things his way. The trouble is, doing things his way sometimes meant stepping onto a stage in a condition that left promoters pale and road managers reaching for antacids. The stories go back decades. There were nights in the early 70s when Willie was still shaking off the polished Nashville mold and building his outlaw identity, where he'd walk out under the lights visibly elsewhere. Not violent, not belligerent, just floating somewhere a few miles above the venue. One of the more frequently told incidents involves a show in Texas during the mid-70s, when bandmates noticed Willie had miscounted the set list, played the same song twice, and delivered an extended that lasted nearly 12 minutes before anyone dared to stop him. The crowd, being a Texas crowd, loved every second of it. The thing about Willie is that even impaired, the guitar playing never really broke down. The voice still worked. The phrasing still landed. What slipped was everything else. The between-song banter that made no sense. The tour manager stories that circled the same point 3 times without arriving anywhere. The occasional confusion about what city they were in. He's talked openly about his relationship with marijuana and, in earlier years, alcohol. There was a period in the 60s before the outlaw era took shape where drinking was as much a part of the routine as sound check, but Willie adapted, survived, and outlasted nearly everyone on this list. His story is the exception. For the artists ahead, the ending gets considerably darker.
But you were always on my...
Number 11, Hank Williams Jr.
The preacher man says it's the end of time.
When your father is Hank Williams, the ghost of excess that doesn't just follow you around, it moves in and hangs pictures on the wall. Hank Jr. spent the first chunk of his career trapped inside a tribute act he never auditioned for, performing his father's songs in his father's costume for audiences who wanted the ghost, not the man. By the early 70s, he was drinking heavily and medicating the kind of identity crisis that no therapist had a name for yet. The fall down Ajax Mountain in Montana in 1975 nearly killed him and reset everything. When he came back louder, harder, and with a bottle in hand that he wasn't hiding anymore. Throughout the late 70s and into the 80s, as his rowdy outlaw sound caught fire, the performances became increasingly unpredictable. There were nights when the energy was electric and the crowd went home buzzing. There were other nights when the energy was something else entirely. Road crew members from that era have described pre-show rituals that would make a sailor uncomfortable. Riders that included enough bourbon to float a modest rowboat. A demeanor backstage that ranged from quietly unreachable to loudly and specifically angry about things no one could immediately identify. He wasn't shy about any of it. He wore it like a badge. The outlaw image demanded authenticity, and Hank Jr. delivered authenticity whether the audience was ready for it or not. Concerts in the early 80s were particularly volatile. He was playing to massive crowds, the biggest of his career, but the consistency of the performance shifted depending on what had happened in the hours before he walked out. Some nights were transcendent. Others were train wrecks that the crowd still talked about years later, though not always fondly. The music never stopped being real. The problems never stopped being real either. Hank Jr. got himself straight eventually, more or less, but the road he traveled to get there left plenty of wreckage behind.
Country folks can survive.
Number 10, Tammy Wynette. The image doesn't fit at first. Tammy Wynette, the first lady of country music. Immaculate hair, pristine dresses, a voice that could shatter something quietly inside a person's chest. But behind that careful presentation was a woman quietly fighting a dependency that had snuck up on her through a side door labeled prescription medicine. It began with pain management. Tammy had suffered serious abdominal issues throughout her career, surgeries that were real, and recovery that was difficult. Doctors prescribed painkillers. The painkillers became a fixture, and over time, the fixture became something she couldn't do a show without. By the mid to late 70s, people close to her were noticing the gaps. The moments on stage where she'd lose the thread of a lyric she'd sung 10,000 times, the slightly glazed quality to performances that had previously been laser sharp. The way conversations backstage sometimes looped without landing. She rarely canceled. That was the thing about Tammy. She showed up. She always showed up. But showing up and being present are two different things, and there were nights when one arrived without the other. Backup singers from those tours have described the experience of watching her from the wings, never quite certain which version of Tammy was going to walk out. Sometimes it was the full force of the woman who owned Nashville. Other times, it was someone who needed steadying at the microphone and a clear signal from the band about where the song was heading. She sought treatment more than once. She fought hard against it. And in interviews, she was often honest about the struggle in a way that must have cost her something, given the era and the industry. Tammy Wynette deserved better than what her own body and the medicine meant to fix it put her through. The voice was real. The pain was real. So was the battle. Number 9. Kristofferson.
Up Sunday morning with no...
Here was a man with a Rhodes Scholarship, a military career, a Phi Beta Kappa key, and a list of songwriting credits that reshaped modern country music. He was also, for a significant stretch of his life, a man who arrived at things sideways. The stories from the early 70s are the ones that get told most often. By that point, Kristofferson had written songs that everyone was recording. His credibility was bulletproof, and he was operating with a kind of confidence that sometimes expressed itself as showing up to events in various states of disarray. There is a famous story, well documented and retold frequently enough to count as music industry folklore, about Kristofferson arriving by helicopter to a farm party hosted by Johnny Cash. He'd been drinking. He stepped off the helicopter, clutching a beer and a guitar. Cash's wife, June Carter, came out, assessed the situation, and turned him around before he could make things worse. On stage, he could be extraordinary or incoherent, sometimes within the same set. His vocal delivery had always been unconventional enough that a slight blurring around the edges wasn't immediately obvious to a casual audience. But musicians who played with him, and there were many of them, knew the difference. He was never one of those artists who pretended the problem didn't exist. He talked about it openly and without self-pity. He got cleaner as the years went on and redirected the same obsessive energy into acting and activism. But for a window in the early part of his career, when the songs were pouring out of him and the parties never seemed to end, Kristofferson performed in conditions that would have grounded anyone without his particular combination of talent and nerve.
And I shave my face and comb my hair.
Number 8. Allan Coe. If outlaw country had a most extreme edge, Allan Coe was standing out there on it, grinning. He came up hard, spent time incarcerated, and arrived in Nashville with a biography that made everyone else's rebel credentials look like a school project. He wasn't performing the outlaw life. He was reporting from it, which made the onstage chaos easier to understand, even when it was harder to watch. Throughout the 70s and into the 80s, Coe's performances were famously unpredictable. He might show up fully locked in and deliver something raw and brilliant. He might show up an hour late, visibly hammered, and proceed to test the patience of every promoter within a 50-mile radius. There are accounts of shows where he forgot which state he was in, which song he was supposed to be playing, and at least once reportedly which decade it was. Audiences at smaller venues, the kind that booked him specifically because of the wildness, often treated the chaos as part of the experience. Promoters did not share this enthusiasm. His rider was legendary in the industry for reasons that had nothing to do with reasonable catering requests. Road managers came and went with unusual frequency. The ones who lasted were the ones who learned that attempting to control Allan Coe was approximately as effective as trying to steer a river with your hands. He never cleaned up the image and never seemed particularly interested in doing so. The music kept coming regardless, unpolished and alive in ways that more disciplined artists couldn't manufacture. But make no mistake, there were nights when the concert people paid for did not happen. What happened instead was something else entirely, and not always something you'd write home about.
Knew there was something strange about this ride.
Number 7. Merle Haggard. Merle Haggard was one of the finest country singers who ever stepped in front of a microphone. He was also, for a long stretch of his life, a man who treated whiskey like a travel companion. He grew up rough, did time at San Quentin, and came out the other side with a work ethic that was genuinely ferocious and a drinking habit that matched it, stride for stride. The 60s and 70s were prolific years. Records were coming constantly, the hits were stacking up, and somewhere underneath all of it, the bottle was a permanent fixture. He was functional in the way that some people managed to be for years before the cracks show up all at once. There were shows during the mid-70s where band members, some of whom had been with him for years, would spend the first couple of songs quietly recalibrating, reading the room, reading Merle, figuring out how much of the man they had that night and adjusting the set accordingly. He talked about it honestly in later years. He described periods where he was drinking from morning through showtime and beyond, where the line between what was happening on stage and what was happening inside his head was not always clear to him in the moment. The music survived it. Maybe that's the most remarkable thing. The phrasing stayed instinctual, the band was tight enough to compensate, and Haggard's natural gifts were deep enough that even compromised, he was still better than most people, fully sober. But the people around him knew, and Haggard himself knew. He wrestled with it for decades, found periods of stability, and ultimately landed on the right side of the story. It just took a long, difficult road to get there.
And I heard him tell.
Number 6, Lefty Frizzell.
And a house in Saginaw Bay.
There is an argument to be made, and plenty of circus music historians have made it that without Lefty Frizzell, there is no Merle Haggard, no Willie Nelson as we know him, possibly no George Jones phrasing the way George Jones phrased, the way Lefty bent a syllable, stretched a word across 3 notes when one would have done the job, rewired what country singing was allowed to be. He was also, for most of his adult life, a man who treated alcohol like oxygen, something required simply to function. The early 50s were his peak on the charts. Songs stacking up, his name everywhere, a voice so distinctive that imitators were already appearing before he'd finished his second year of fame. And underneath all of it, the drinking was already in charge. Performances during that period were unreliable in ways that frustrated Columbia Records and baffled promoters who had sold tickets based on a name that might or might not show up in usable condition. There were nights when Lefty walked out and reminded everyone exactly why they'd come. The voice was untouchable when it was working, warm and loose and heartbreakingly precise all at once. There were other nights when it wasn't working, when the man at the microphone was operating on instinct alone because conscious decision-making had clocked out sometime around mid-afternoon. Bandmates from those years describe a rhythm to the chaos that they eventually learned to read, certain signs in the dressing room, a particular quality to the silence before he spoke. They'd know within the first few minutes of arriving at a venue which version of the night they were in for. He never fully recovered the commercial momentum of those early years. The hits slowed, the bookings got smaller. The drinking did not slow and did not get smaller. It expanded to fill whatever space the career had vacated. Lefty Frizzell died in 1975 at the age of 47 from a stroke, his body worn down by decades of hard living that never really let up long enough for anything to heal properly. What he left behind was a vocal style that echoed through every great country singer who came after him. What he left too early was everything else he might have given if the bottle had ever loosened its grip. It never did.
But he called me.
Number 5, Waylon Jennings.
A long time forgotten.
By the time Waylon Jennings was at the peak of his commercial power in the late 70s, he was also in the grip of a cocaine habit that was consuming extraordinary amounts of money and energy on a daily basis. He's written about it himself in detail, without varnish. The quantities were not casual. The behavior it produced was not manageable. And the effect on touring and recording was significant, even when the results still sounded like Waylon Jennings, because he was Waylon Jennings, and some things apparently survive everything. There were shows during this period where road managers handled logistics with the quiet efficiency of people who had accepted they were working on a different kind of timeline, not the scheduled one, a more fluid, more complicated one that involved a lot of waiting and a lot of hope that things would stabilize before showtime. Sometimes they did. Waylon could walk out there and be utterly commanding. The low rumble of the voice, the Telecaster slung down around his knees, the complete and total authority of a man who had won his battle with Nashville on his own terms. Those nights were extraordinary. Other nights, the performance had rough edges that weren't the artistic kind. But the concentration wasn't quite there. The between-song beats stretched into uncomfortable silences. Band members exchanged the specific look that touring musicians develop for exactly this situation. He got clean in the early 80s, went through it with characteristic bluntness and without asking for applause, and came out the other side, making music with the same stubborn independence he'd always had. Waylon Jennings survived his worst years and remained Waylon Jennings throughout. That's either a miracle or a testament to what he was made of. Probably both.
Of the bad times or the bad things.
Number 4, Johnny Cash.
I hurt myself.
There is probably no story on this list more thoroughly documented, more publicly examined, and more ultimately redemptive than Johnny Cash's relationship with pills and alcohol. He started with amphetamines on the road in the late 50s, needing the energy to sustain a touring schedule that would have broken a man without his particular constitution. The pills kept him going. Then the pills started directing the operation. Then he added alcohol to the mix, and the combination produced something unpredictable and often frightening. The late 60s were the worst of it. He was thin, hollow-eyed, erratic. He drove a camper into a national forest and started a wildfire. He woke up in jail in more than one city after wandering into situations he couldn't fully account for. He broke up sets in the middle of songs. He said things into microphones at concerts that left audiences uncertain whether to laugh or leave. The Grand Ole Opry, the institution that had meant everything to country music for decades, removed him from their roster. That's how far it went. The Opry had tolerated a great deal from a great many people. Cash exceeded their tolerance. He nearly destroyed everything: his career, his family, his life. The redemption that followed, the prison concerts, the recordings with Rick Rubin decades later, the late career second act that a man in his condition had no business pulling off, all of it happened because somewhere underneath the wreckage, the real man was still there. But there were years when nobody, including Cash himself, was certain of that. The performances during those years were by turns astonishing and heartbreaking, and sometimes both in the same 45 minutes.
Everyone I know.
Number 3, Keith Whitley.
It's amazing how you...
This one sits differently than the others. Keith Whitley didn't survive it. He was found dead on May 9th, 1989, at his home in Nashville. He was 33 years old. The cause was acute alcohol poisoning. His blood alcohol level was nearly 6 times the legal limit. He'd been sober for periods. He'd tried treatment. He had a wife, Lori Morgan, who was also a rising country star, and a young son. He had a career that was just finally starting to deliver on the extraordinary promise he'd shown since he was a teenager, picking with Ralph Stanley in the mountains of Kentucky. That's the part that makes it hard to sit with. Keith Whitley was genuinely gifted in a way that went beyond technique. The voice had a kind of emotional truth to it that couldn't be taught and couldn't be faked. When he sang, you believed him completely because he wasn't performing the feeling. He was in it. He was also in something else, something darker that ran alongside the talent the entire time. There were shows in the mid-'80s before his Columbia Records breakthrough where venue owners had to make difficult decisions about whether to open the curtain. Bandmates described pulling up to venues and spending the hour before showtime in a state of controlled anxiety, not knowing which Keith they were getting. Sometimes the professional appeared and delivered something that left everyone breathless. Other times the show simply didn't happen. The hits came late, hitting the top of the charts in 1988 and 1989, just as the drinking was reaching its final and fatal momentum. The cruelty of the timing is almost impossible to process.
Without saying a word, you can light up.
Nashville lost something irreplaceable the morning Keith Whitley died. The music he left behind still sounds like someone telling the truth from a very specific kind of pain. Number 2, George Jones.
She told him, forget.
No list about country artists and self-destruction is complete without George Jones at or near the very top of it. And No-Show Jones, as he became known throughout the industry, earned that nickname the hard way, over decades, across hundreds of canceled concerts, forfeited deposits, and furious promoters who eventually learned to build escape clauses into their contracts. The drinking started early and became something almost mythological over time. His first wife described pouring every bottle in the house down the drain while he was asleep, only to come back later and find him riding a lawnmower to the nearest liquor store because she'd also hidden the car keys. The lawnmower was real. The distance was reportedly 8 miles. He made it. On stage, Jones at his best was unmatched. Nobody in country music history has phrased a lyric with more precision and emotional weight. When he was locked in, when whatever combination of factors aligned that allowed the full force of the man to show up, the performance was something audiences remembered for the rest of their lives. The problem was the unpredictability. Promoters across the country in the 70s and early 80s developed a specific anxiety tied specifically to George Jones' bookings. Had he been seen? Was he answering his phone? Was someone physically with him from the moment the bus arrived to the moment he hit the stage? There were tours where his then-wife Tammy Wynette essentially supervised his movements with a combination of love and tactical management that resembled less a marriage and more a complex logistical operation. He canceled so many shows during a particularly rough stretch in the late 70s that his booking agents reportedly kept a separate tally. Not a list of his appearances, a list of his no-shows. It was longer. He got sober in the early 80s, slid back, got sober again, and eventually stabilized into a long and productive second chapter. His 1980 recording of what many consider one of country music's greatest performances is a song he has described making while fighting his way through the worst of the addiction. You can hear something in it that goes beyond technique.
He kept her pictures all.
George Jones survived everything. The lawnmower story, the canceled shows, the years when nobody knew if he'd make it. He died in 2013 at 81 years old, which under the circumstances qualifies as one of the more remarkable outcomes in music history. Number 1, Hank Williams. There was no avoiding it. Every story on this list exists, at least in part, in the shadow of Hank Williams. He didn't just define country music's relationship with self-destruction. He created the template that everyone who came after him, either consciously or unconsciously, referenced. Herm King Williams from Georgiana, Alabama, was dead at 29 years old on the first morning of 1953 in the backseat of a Cadillac somewhere between Knoxville and Canton, Ohio, on his way to a show he would never play. The Grand Ole Opry fired him in 1952 for missing too many performances, for showing up for the ones he did make in conditions that ranged from barely functional to completely impossible, for making the institution's management feel that no booking was ever fully secure and no curtain call was ever fully guaranteed. He drank because his back hurt. He took chloral hydrate because it was prescribed. He combined them with alcohol because the pain was relentless, and the road never stopped, and no one around him was equipped to do anything except watch it happen and hope tonight wasn't the night everything fell apart entirely. There were performances of Hank Williams during those final years that were extraordinary, regardless of the circumstances. The rawness was real. The voice had a quality that nobody before or since has quite reproduced. Something that sounded like the deep rural South distilled into pure audio. Honest and aching and completely without pretense.
Don't you think, baby?
And then there were nights like the one in Cherry Ball, Minnesota, in the summer of 1952, where he had to be helped to the microphone, where he was visibly unable to stand without support, where the audience watched a man coming apart in real time and applauded anyway, because even at his worst, Hank Williams still sounded like no one else alive. The tragedy isn't just that he died young, though the loss of what he might have produced in the decades ahead is genuinely staggering to consider. The tragedy is that the system around him, the industry, the culture, the medical understanding of the time, had absolutely nothing to offer him. He was a problem to be managed until he became a problem too large to manage. He left behind a catalog that changed American music permanently. He also left behind the image of a man in a white suit leaning into a microphone in the dark, too wasted to stand upright, still making something that could reach inside a stranger and find the exact center of their grief. Nobody has ever quite figured out how he did that. Nobody since has quite managed to do it the same way. That wraps up our list of 12 country artists, too wasted to perform. Some of them found their way back, some of them didn't. All of them remind us that the music we love comes from somewhere real, and sometimes that somewhere is very dark indeed. If this one moved you, don't miss our next video covering 10 country albums recorded under impossible circumstances, hidden stories from the studio, the road, and everything in between. Thanks for watching. Keep the music alive.